Chapter 15 of The Haunted Bookshop. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Haunted Bookshop by Christopher Morley. Chapter 15. Mr. Chapman Waves His Wand. Gissing Street will not soon forget the explosion at the Haunted Bookshop. When it was learned that the cellar of Weintraub's pharmacy contained just the information for which the Department of Justice had been looking for 4 years, and that the inoffensive German-American druggist had been the artisan of hundreds of incendiary bombs that had been placed on American and Allied shipping and ammunition plants, and that this same Weintraub had committed suicide when arrested on Bromfield Street in Boston the next day, Gissing Street hummed with excitement. The Milwaukee lunch did a roaring business among the sensation-seekers who came to view the ruins of the bookshop. When it became known that fragments of a cabin plan of the George Washington had been found in Metzger's pocket, and the confession of an accomplice on the kitchen staff of the Octagon Hotel showed that the bomb, disguised as a copy of one of Woodrow Wilson's favorite books, was to have been placed in the presidential suite of the steamship, indignation knew no bounds. Mrs. J. F. Smith left Mrs. Schiller's lodgings, declaring that she would stay no longer in a pro-German colony. And Aubrey was able at last to get a much-needed bath. For the next 3 days he was too busy with agents of the Department of Justice to be able to carry on an investigation of his own that greatly occupied his mind. But late on Friday afternoon he called at the bookshop to talk things over. The debris had all been neatly cleared away and the shattered front of the building boarded up. Inside, Aubrey found Roger seated on the floor, looking over piles of volumes that were heaped pell-mell around him. Through Mr. Chapman's influence with a well-known firm of builders, the bookseller had been able to get men to work at once in making repairs, but even so it would be at least 10 days, he said, before he could reopen for business. "I hate to lose the value of all this advertising," he lamented. "It isn't often that a second-hand bookstore gets onto the front pages of the newspapers." "I thought you didn't believe in advertising," said Aubrey. "The kind of advertising I believe in," said Roger, "is the kind that doesn't cost you anything." Aubrey smiled as he looked round at the dismantled shop. "It seems to me that this'll cost you a tidy bit when the bill comes in." "My dear fellow," said Roger, "this is just what I needed. I was getting into a rut. The explosion has blown out a whole lot of books I had forgotten about, and didn't even know I had. Look, here's an old copy of How to Be Happy Though Married, which I see the publisher lists as fiction. Here's Urn Burial and the Love Affairs of a Bibliomaniac, and Mistletoe's Book of Deplorable Facts. I'm going to have a thorough house cleaning. I'm thinking seriously of putting in a vacuum cleaner and a cash register. Titania was quite right. The place was too dirty. That girl has given me a lot of ideas." Aubrey wanted to ask where she was, but didn't like to say so point blank. "There's no question about it," said Roger. "An explosion now and then does one good. Since the reporters got here and dragged the whole yarn out of us, I've had half a dozen offers from publishers for my book. A Lyceum Bureau wants me to lecture on bookselling as a form of public service. I've had 500 letters from people asking when the shop will reopen for business, and the American Booksellers Association has invited me to give an address at its convention next spring. It's the first recognition I've ever had. If it weren't for poor dear old Bach. Come, we've buried him in the backyard. I want to show you his grave." Over a pathetically small mound near the fence, a bunch of big yellow chrysanthemums were standing in a vase. "Titania put those there," said Roger. "She says she's going to plant a dogwood tree there in the spring. We intend to put up a little stone for him, and I'm trying to think of an inscription. I thought of De Mortuis Nil Nisi Bonum, but that's a bit too flippant." The living quarters of the house had not been damaged by the explosion, and Roger took Aubrey back to the den. "You've come just at the right time," he said. "Mr. Chapman's coming to dinner this evening, and we'll all have a good talk. There's a lot about this business I don't understand yet." Aubrey was still keeping his eye open for a sign of Titania's presence, and Roger noticed his wandering gaze. "This is Miss Chapman's afternoon off," he said. "She got her first salary to-day and was so much exhilarated that she went to New York to blow it in. She's out with her father. Excuse me, please. I'm going to help Helen get dinner ready." Aubrey sat down by the fire and lit his pipe. The burden of his meditation was that it was just a week since he had first met Titania, and in all that week there had been no waking moment when he had not thought of her. He was wondering how long it might take for a girl to fall in love. A man, he knew now, could fall in love in 5 minutes, but how did it work with girls? He was also thinking what unique Dainty Bits advertising copy he could build. Like all ad men, he always spoke of building an ad, never of writing one, out of this affair, if he could only use the inside stuff. He heard a rustle behind him, and there she was. She had on a gray fur coat and a lively little hat. Her cheeks were delicately tinted by the winter air. Aubrey rose. "Why, Mr. Gilbert," she said, "where have you been keeping yourself when I wanted to see you so badly? I haven't seen you, not to talk to, since last Sunday." He found it impossible to say anything intelligible. She threw off her coat and went on, with a wistful gravity that became her ever more than smiles. "Mr. Mifflin has told me some more about what you did last week. I mean, how you took a room across the street and spied upon that hateful man and saw through the whole thing when we were too blind to know what was going on. And I want to apologize for the silly things I said that Sunday morning. Will you forgive me?" Aubrey had never felt his self-salesmanship ability at such a low ebb. To his unspeakable horror, he felt his eyes betray him. They grew moist. "Please don't talk like that," he said. "I had no right to do what I did, anyway, and I was wrong in what I said about Mr. Mifflin. I don't wonder you were angry." "Now, surely you're not going to deprive me of the pleasure of thanking you," she said. "You know as well as I do that you saved my life, all our lives, that night. I guess you'd have saved poor Bock's, too, if you could." Her eyes filled with tears. "If anybody deserves credit, it's you," he said. "Why, if it hadn't been for you, they'd have been away with that suitcase, and probably Metzger would have got his bomb on board the ship and blown up the president." "I'm not arguing with you," she said. "I'm just thanking you." It was a happy little party that sat down in Roger's dining room that evening. Helen had prepared egg Samuel Butler in Aubrey's honor, and Mr. Chapman had brought 2 bottles of champagne to pledge the future success of the bookshop. Aubrey was called upon to announce the result of his conferences with the Secret Service men who had been looking up Weintraub's record. "It all seems so simple now," he said, "that I wonder we didn't see through it at once. You see, we all made the mistake of assuming that German plotting would stop automatically when the armistice was signed. It seems this man Weintraub was one of the most dangerous spies Germany had in this country. 30 or 40 fires and explosions on our ships at sea are said to have been due to his work. As he had lived here so long and taken out citizens' papers, no one suspected him. But after his death, his wife, whom he had treated very brutally, gave way and told a great deal about his activities. According to her, as soon as it was announced that the president would go to the peace conference, Weintraub made up his mind to get a bomb into the president's cabin on board the George Washington. Mrs. Weintraub tried to dissuade him from it, as she was in secret opposed to these murderous plots of his, but he threatened to kill her if she thwarted him. She lived in terror of her life. I can believe it, for I remember her face when her husband looked at her. Of course, to make the bomb was simple enough for Weintraub. He had an infernally complete laboratory in the cellar of his house, where he had made hundreds. The problem was how to make a bomb that would not look suspicious, and how to get it into the president's private cabin. He hit on the idea of binding it into the cover of a book. How he came to choose that particular volume, I don't know. "I think probably I gave him the idea quite innocently," said Roger. "He used to come in here a good deal, and one day he asked me whether Mr. Wilson was a great reader. I said that I believed he was, and then mentioned the Cromwell, which I had heard was one of Wilson's favorite books. Weintraub was much interested, and said he must read the book some day. I remember now that he stood in that alcove for some time, looking it over." "Well," said Aubrey, "it must have seemed to him that luck was playing into his hands. This man Metzger, who had been an assistant chef at the Octagon for years, was slated to go on board the George Washington with the party of cooks from that hotel who were to prepare the president's meals. Weintraub was informed of all this from someone higher up in the German spy organization. Metzger, who was known as Messier at the hotel, was a very clever chef and had fake passports as a Swiss citizen. He was another tool of the organization. By the original scheme there would have been no direct communication between Weintraub and Metzger, but the go-between was spotted by the Department of Justice on another count and is now behind bars at Atlanta. It seems that Weintraub had conceived the idea that the least suspicious way of passing his messages to Metzger would be to slip them into the copy of some book, a book little likely to be purchased in a second-hand bookshop. Metzger had been informed what the book was, but, perhaps owing to the unexpected removal of the go-between, did not know in which shop he was to find it. That explains why so many booksellers